Anyway, welcome everybody. So, Masha, I mentioned before the first thing that you wrote, that in some ways it's some kind of bookends to your recent book, which is Autocracy, Rules for Survival. This is the piece that Masha published on November 10th, 2016. The election was on November 6th or 7th, right? Or 8th. No, it was November 8th was the election.
November 8th was the election, yes.
November 8th was the election. This was published. It was already in Masha's mind the night of the election. I want to read just briefly from it. One of the things that moved me very much when I read it that day was when Masha wrote, "I have lived in autocracies most of my life, and I have spent much of my career writing about Vladimir Putin's Russia. I have learned a few rules for surviving in an autocracy and salvaging your sanity and self-respect. It might be worth considering them now." I suspect at that time, most Americans didn't even really appreciate what you were writing. Do you find now that people are looking back and seeing these as prescient, or do you feel looking back you didn't cover the things you wished you had covered? Do you find that Americans weren't ready to hear it or were open to it?
I think a lot of people were open to it because, I mean, the piece went mega viral, broke the New York Book Review site, and just, it was broke my smartwatch. It was a really funny, sad story. I like most people, I think, I went to an election watching party that went sour, and I kind of,
we all have those stories.
Tried to slink away without saying goodbye to the hosts, who might actually be on this call. And as I was riding my bike back from Queens to Harlem, it's a long ride, and I started getting phone calls and messages from friends asking, you know, what do we do now? And I thought, well, that's a pretty ridiculous question to ask me. I'm living in exile. I obviously don't know what we do now. But as I said, it's a long ride, so I was thinking, is there anything that I actually have learned that I could put in a sort of letter from the future? And what I decided to write about was not how do you overthrow an autocracy, how to prevent an autocratic attempt, because actually I don't know, or at least I didn't. But about what happens to your mind and your soul when you're living in this reality that is just crazy, when nothing means anything, when things that we believed in, ideals that we held, suddenly become corrupted, yeah. Right? So that's what the piece is really about, and there are a couple of rules in it. I don't think I remember all the rules, but there are a couple of rules in it that I will absolutely reiterate, and one of them actually end up being part of this book that I just wrote. And that's institutions will not save you. You know, because Americans have this belief in institutions that's really kind of religious, right? Because we imbue institutions with two magical qualities. One of which is that they're self-repairing. So no matter what you do to them, they're going to fix themselves and keep working, which, you know, nothing works like that in the world. And the other is that they work in a vacuum. It's like it doesn't matter what goes around them. It's just, they're so perfectly designed 250 years ago that they will just keep churning. You know, and that's, logical people don't usually believe things like that. Reasonable people don't believe things like that unless they believe in magic. And of course, we have seen how easy it is to attack institutions and how difficult it is for institutions to function in the face of a bad actor, but especially in situations when the attention of the public is not on them.
Right.
And when they're not fueled and emboldened by public.
How much do you think is a result of the fact that there are fewer and fewer journalists? There are just fewer and fewer people reporting. There's just fewer and fewer independent journalists that exist.
Yeah, no, that's a super important thing. And, you know, I think it has, like, it's very easy, actually, to understand what has happened. Right? You can't have politics without journalists. You can have journalism without politics, right? But you can't have politics without journalism. And that means that we have lost local politics.
Yeah.
Because we have lost local journalism. It used to be that pretty much, and this is not that long ago, right? Less than a generation ago, every community in the United States had journalists who were covering the school board, covering the zoning meetings, covering, all of the things, all of the ways in which we get together to talk about how we live together, which is politics. Okay? And we don't have that anymore. The other thing that we don't have is that we don't have journalists that people know, right? Because of course these local reporters, everybody who lived in America knew journalists.
Yeah.
Because there were journalists working in the community. And now not knowing journalists means that it's so much easier to demonize journalists and to undermine trust in national media, right? And we've seen the really horrifying consequences of that, of course, during the protests when we see police actually specifically targeting journalists.
Yeah.
Because journalists have been othered and have been portrayed as enemies of the people to such an extent.
Yeah. When I really thought of you when I've been watching, as we all have these horrific videos. I don't know if you saw also the one that just came out today or yesterday about Philadelphia. There's a 10-minute video on the New York Times of the police attack on a very peaceful protest. They actually get the protesters into a closed area and then release tear gas and baton beating. And you can hear somebody saying, I'm the press, here's, and you watch them just attack physically and spray them. That's kind of unheard of in America, the idea that, and now it's become a routine part of the dynamic. And it seems so undermined by what we couldn't have imagined. People were listening to Trump in those rallies, and it turns out, in fact, it's having an impact, which I want to read your rules just for those of you who didn't. Everybody should read this essay. You should all Google it and read it, but I'm going to read these rules and then go to Masha's current book. Rule number 1, believe the autocrat. I'm not going to read everything that Masha wrote. You should, but these are important. Rule number 1, believe the autocrat. Rule number 2, do not be taken in by small signs of normality. Rule number 3, institutions will not save you. Rule number 4, be outraged. Rule number 5, don't make compromises. Rule number 6, remember the future. So those rules, actually, when I read them, Masha, they've had a huge impact on me. And the remember the future, I think, might be the most significant. Masha, you might remember that you came to speak at CBST soon after this. And I asked you, since you lived through Putin's Russia and the escalation of Putin's autocratic policies and personality, what was it like to live there? It was almost like I wanted to know, and you said to me, well, people got together, friends still drank wine, and people have parties, and you still talk to your friends. And that, for those of us in America who hadn't experienced what Eastern Europeans know in their bones, was chilling to me. We imagine, and this is I want you to talk about this because you go into this in Surviving Autocracy and in some of your other writings. We somehow imagine that Hitler, Stalin, Putin, now in our generation, they're somehow these mega characters that are so different than anything that we're experiencing, that if they happened now, we would see it immediately. And it doesn't happen that way. We imagine that they were masterminds. Like Americans think that Putin is a mastermind and somehow knew everything and is just, so if you could talk about that piece of it a little bit for us.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I think it's one of the big ones, right? I think it's the only thing that's more scary than imagining that we're being governed by an evil genius is imagining that we're being governed by a mean idiot, right? We, at least, it's something, when we think about the really giant, horrific periods of history, we imagine that the forces behind them were equal to the damage that they did. They were just as evil, just as brilliant as the destruction they wrought. And in fact, that's generally not the case. Generally, humanity has sort of stumbled into its darkest moments. And I think that incompetence, and in Trump's case, it's a militant incompetence, right? It's like, why I'm like a smart person, he says occasionally, but really he has no respect for intelligence. He has total disdain for expertise. He has disgust for complexity, right? And those things are themselves the dangers. They don't mitigate the danger that he poses. They really, they are the destructive forces because they're so militant. And of course, that's what we've seen with the pandemic. Just the contempt that he has for expertise and for information and for knowledge-based decisions, and people die.
I remember you said I think you were on Rachel Maddow soon after he was elected. I think it was Rachel Maddow, or maybe it was Samantha Bee. Who can remember? I've followed you on all of these, but one of them said to you, "So, what are you the most afraid of?" And you said, "A nuclear war." And we couldn't have imagined this pandemic would end up killing so many of us.
Right.
So let's go back to our Hungarian sociologist. Now that we can talk about this a little bit more. So the three levels that he describes, which I found very useful, is this. The first one, which is what you say we're in right now, because we have an election. And do you believe this election kind of is the last chance?
It's likely the last chance. I mean, look, and I take, so he has this, in his model, the autocratic attempt is when you can still reverse it by electoral means. I think that probably it can be expanded in our case to say when it's still reversible by institutional means. For example, if Donald Trump had been removed from office as a result of impeachment, we would have seen that that our institutions are working, and in fact, the autocratic attempt has been reversed. But that didn't happen. That's a real danger sign, right? The impeachment trial happened exactly as it's designed to happen, and it didn't end with the removal from office. So yes, I think it's very likely that the election in November is our last chance. No other institution, at least if it's working as it's designed to work, is going to remove Trump from office, right? So if it happens in November, I mean, there are also all sorts of dangers connected with his already having laid the groundwork for not recognizing the results of the election.
Yeah. That's certainly a huge fear of how I'm hearing an echo. I'm not sure what to do about that, but okay. How would you describe the contrast, the compare and contrast with Putin? And what do you see? Yeah, just talk about Putin and Trump a little bit.
Well, I mean, they're very, very different, right? And you don't have to go deep into analysis to see how different they are. They're temperamentally incredibly different. Putin prides himself on being controlled and never showing his emotions. Trump is raw emotion, right? Putin, so he drowns you out when with words, when he wants to, which he always does, dominate sort of the information sphere. But it's like boring words. It's like bureaucratic speak. It's numbers and concepts. And if you fact check him, it's all wrong. But it's completely deadening. And Trump is effusive. Everything is tremendous, the best, the greatest, or like horrible. So in that sense, they're the opposite. But they do a few things in a very similar way. And I don't think it's because there's a special connection between them. It's that I spent 20 years writing about Putin. And so I think, I have like a special pair of glasses that help me see things that are in front of us, but I can focus on them. I think that if I had spent 20 years writing about Berlusconi, if I had experience working in Hungary, in Brazil, in Venezuela, in the Philippines, in Israel, I'd bring a different pair of glasses that was also incredibly useful. But this is what I've got. And I think it's helpful. So one thing that they both do is they engage in the power lie, or that's what I call it. And what I mean by that is that usually when politicians lie, they lie and like all of us, in order to make you believe something, right? It's like, Rabbi Kleinbaum, I'm sorry I couldn't speak at Shabbat because the dog ate my homework. And like, I want you to believe that. It's stupid, but I really want you to think that something happened. But Trump lies about the weather.
Yeah.
He actually claimed, if you recall, and this was all overshadowed by the debate about the size of the crowd, but remember he claimed that the sun came out when he gave his inaugural speech?
Yes.
And you could watch the video.
Yeah.
It was raining. You know. So why would somebody lie about the weather? It's not to make you believe that the weather is not what you're experiencing on your own skin. It's to show that he can say whatever he wants to whenever he wants to. And what are you going to do about it? You know, and for the president, when he lies to journalists or he lies on Twitter, it's always also a message to the media. You are going to have to engage with what I say no matter what. I've got the biggest microphone. And so I get to warp this reality, to warp this sense that we have a shared reality just by saying anything. And that's, in that way, he and Putin are really, really similar.
And so too with Orban and what's
yeah, I don't know. I think Orban is a little, I don't know that he like deploys the power in that exact way.
Okay, we have a question from Jill Weiss, a CBST member and a great trans activist and lawyer, very important person in the world. Important question. Given the historical exclusion of trans people from LGB spaces, which is just now starting to break up, what are your thoughts about what it will take to further create bridges within the community?
I don't know. I mean, I think we just keep doing what we're doing. I mean, it's like, we actually wrote the playbook. You come out and create, you know, a kind of common politics, common cause. I think but in terms of that, and I'd really love to hear, Jill, what you think. But it seems to me that the Supreme Court decision, in a way, you know, there's a kind of cementing effect to it, right? Because in Bostock, because I think there was a real possibility that the court would rule one way in the trans case and in a different way in the gay case. And in fact, there was kind of an amazing moment when Pam Carlin said, well, yeah, like, I'm not arguing the trans part of it. They lose. I'm arguing the gay part of it. And the fact that this decision actually addresses both kinds of cases together, you know, not that the Supreme Court is like the definer of our identity, far from it, but there's something really, really, I think, cementing in having won this victory together, and you know, the first trans rights case to reach the Supreme Court in substance. And
it was so interesting. I think that case came out on a Monday, if I remember right, last Monday, and the Friday before that, I mean, really, literally, just right before the weekend, Trump came out with his statement that he was going to issue an executive order, basically eliminating trans health.
Oh, I think that was very much purposeful.
You do?
You know,
yeah.
It was, it was a Health and Human Services rule. So they sat there and they read 350 pages of something that quite likely was going to be rendered irrelevant, and in fact has been, right? In advance of the Supreme Court decision. Any kind of reasonable, you know, a reasonable, efficient bureaucracy would have waited for the decision before issuing the rule. Especially because the whole rule was written in response to an Obama administration rule that was also tied up in litigation, right? So it's completely a symbolic statement. It's a 350-page symbolic statement that says, we want you dead.
Yes.
You know, it's a statement that comes out that's legally irrelevant, but very, very loud.
Yeah.
And it's in the middle of a pandemic to say that we want these people discriminated against in the provision of healthcare.
Yep.
Make no mistake about what that says. It says we want you dead.
Yep. And they knew that the decision was coming down very soon, since we're at the end of the court season. So they knew it was going to be happening within, obviously it had to happen by June 30th. So it was
Exactly.
so the time.
Exactly.
Very interesting. And do you imagine that Putin is enamored of Trump? What do you think Putin's attitude toward Trump is?
I think it's been a puzzling time for Putin, because in some ways for Putin, dealing with somebody who was as sort of crazy and unpredictable as Trump has been a little difficult, right? He's actually used to positioning himself as a kind of madman in relationship to somebody who confronts him in a consistent way. In here, the confrontation went away. Putin's politics is very dependent on having the United States as an enemy.
Yep.
If you watch Russian television, a lot of it is actually very, very negative about the United States and Trump. Okay? And yet, you know, he seems to be fooled that, or at least have the potential as a useful idiot. I mean, we just saw this absolutely extraordinary thing. The Times just has this incredible scoop that just came out a few hours ago, right, on that Russia has
I've been busy, so I missed it. Tell us.
I'm going to tell you. The Times is writing that Russia is paying the Taliban, has been paying the Taliban to kill American troops.
Wow.
Which is just, and that Trump has known this for a number of weeks and hasn't said anything. And you know, I think it's a measure of his love for Putin, but also of his just utter disregard for any law but his own.
Yeah. How do you understand the Republican Party's being enamored with Trump and being such an enabler that there's been, until this most recent time with the Lincoln Project, there have been no Republicans who have really taken him on?
Unfortunately,
would you say that's a kind of a tip that they're in the autocrats' climb to power?
People fall into line really quickly because most people who have power will do anything to avoid losing it.
Yeah, and
that's what we're observing with the Republican Party. The Republican Party is, every Republican who holds an elected seat is dependent on Trump to keep the seat.
Yeah.
Because Trump is speaking directly to their voters. So they are no longer speaking to their voters. They're speaking to Trump to make sure that he doesn't start trashing them on Twitter, which will cost them the re-election. You know, the senators that we have seen engage in any criticism of Trump are the ones who decided to end their careers, to forfeit their chance at re-election, possibly with the long view to running for office again once he's gone.
All right, here's a very special question for you. It takes a little while to get to the question. Trump, for me, is the music man. The Republican Party has been working on a right-wing advance for 30 years, dating from the civil rights and the Nixon's appeal in the South. How do we work on the rights institutions that are thrilled by the music man Trump? His enablers are busy and not going away. Here's the question. Can you talk about the relationship with your brother, Keith?
It's like a Russian logic problem, right?
Well, do what you want with that.
I love my brother Keith. He is my baby brother. He is a brilliant writer, a wonderful teacher, and I'm very lucky to be living in the same city as he is after so many years. Although he's about to send his kids to camp, so we're not going to be seeing each other for a while because our sort of COVID standards are different.
Yeah, your pod. So for those of you who don't know, Keith is also a writer. I don't know that everybody knows your brother. Okay, back to Magyar. Am I pronouncing that correctly? The Hungarian sociologist?
Magyar, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Magyar. So can you talk a little bit more about the paradigm that you mentioned, starting with, you've discussed this first one. Can you discuss his paradigm a little bit more?
So, as I said, it's a 1,000-page book.
Yeah.
Right? But and it's
Okay, give us a paragraph. There you go.
it's
You're singing for your dinner, right? So you get to.
It's incredibly useful. But like one of the things that he does is he looks at what the autocrat does to start the attempt, right? At first, there are all these attacks on institutions and checks and balances. And this is something, so, I've mentioned that he's packing the courts. Now, at this point, Trump
And
has
he's writing about Eastern Europe.
He's writing about Eastern Europe.
Right. And you're applying it to the United States.
And check it out, Trump has been more active in appointing federal judges than any president.
Yeah.
He has now appointed 200 federal judges, which means that if we don't get him out of office in November, we're not going to be able to recover. Yeah. I mean, even recovering from 200 federal judges is going to be extremely difficult.
Yeah.
And I'm not even mentioning he has had the incredible luck of appointing 2 Supreme Court justices in his first term, but and I hope his only term. But how active he has been in appointing judges is extraordinary. But also look at the kind of judges he's appointing. Right? Not only is he appointing very conservative judges, but he's appointing inexperienced judges, right? His contempt for expertise, and judges who are opposed to the very culture of the judicial system. Right? So it's very much a part of his attack on government as currently constituted, which is how I heard his slogan, "Drain the swamp." Drain the swamp is not, let's root out corruption in American government. Drain the swamp is let's destroy the government as we have seen it constituted. And so all of his appointments to the heads of federal agencies are people who are not only not qualified, but are actually opposed to the very purpose of the agency.
And look, he's not the first Republican. I mean, obviously, the Republicans for generations have been saying that government is a bad thing and creating a climate.
Thank you for feeding me that cue. And actually, the previous questioner, the one who wanted to know about my relationship with my brother, was also referring to this. And I think that's a very important thing to remember, right? I mean, because we often talk about Trump as though he were an anomaly, like he just came from outer space, or the Russians.
Media, right, yeah.
And he's certainly very unusual, but the groundwork for Trump was laid by the developments in American politics in some ways over the last 50 years, in some ways over the last 40 years, and in some ways over the last 20 years, right? And by that I mean, 50 years sort of since the Democrats decided that politics was really technocratic, right? You just had to have like competent managers. 40 years since we really got into this government is a necessary evil, the less government, the better mindset. 20 years since since 9/11, since we've been conceiving of ourselves as a nation under siege, right? And concentrating power in the executive branch, and seeing ourselves as us against the world. And all of those things create the possibility of Trump. But Trump is like taking a quantum leap from a running start, right? He's not from outer space, but he also wasn't predetermined. But in order to recover from Trump, we're going to have to do more than just go to like some sort of imaginary pre-Trumpian normal.
Right.
Because and the another super important thing I forgot to mention just now is the marriage of money and power, which we really have not questioned sufficiently.
Yeah. Okay, other questions from congregants? You mentioned that dominating media is a strategy used by autocrats. In this regards, gaslighting is a strategy that has been previously used as well. And by gaslighting, I assume they're meaning this idea of just lying and making people feel crazy.
Yeah, it's very much his attack on language, right? Yeah. An attack on discourse. It's like he uses words under totalitarianism. Words were used to mean their opposite. Right? So everybody has read 1984, War is Peace. And when I was growing up, that was very much how we were taught to speak. Like freedom was unfreedom. What we had in the Soviet Union was democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Trump does that, actually. He does it with non-ideological words, but he does it with words that have to do with relationships to power, or relationships of power. Like when he says that he's the victim of a witch hunt. Like the most powerful man in the world can't be the victim of a witch hunt. You have to have less power than the people who are witch hunting you. But Trump uses those words to mean their opposite. But autocrats, modern autocrats like Putin, like Orban, they mean words to mean nothing. Or they use words to mean nothing. They were like, create these concepts that are just like, they just make the world unknowable. And Trump does that a lot. Like there are these word piles that he creates. When it's just like the stream of consciousness and you can't make sense of it. But also, he will say things and actually then explicitly say, oh, that meant nothing. Right? Inject yourself with chlorine. Oh, that was a joke.
Yeah.
Slow down testing. Oh, that was a joke. And so we're in this situation as journalists where how do you report on a president who makes statements that have real life consequences? Right? Immediately after he said, inject yourself with chlorine, people started calling poison centers. They have real life consequences, but he says that they mean nothing. And they're absurd in the face of it. Right? And there's really no way for the media to win in that situation. I mean, I think that we have to think of our strategy as journalists as harm reduction. Right? Because
I really appreciate that concept. Yeah, go ahead. I want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to be able to avoid damage, and we just have to know that. And so, every time we do a story, we have to think about, how do we at least try to reduce the damage that it's doing.
I wonder, you just published a piece in the New Yorker, and for those of you who don't know Masha's writing, is that they are a writer for the New Yorker and publish frequently pieces that are very contemporary and responsive. And one of the recent pieces that you've done is about the lack of, or the issue of moral clarity or relativism. Some of folks might have remembered that the New York Times published an op-ed by Cotton that actually advocated the use of military force against rioters and supporting Trump's use of military force. So would you talk about that a little bit, about that piece and what you were saying about how there isn't, about the role of journalists here and of our media?
Right. So there's been a debate among journalists, and sometimes I worry that we really get into a kind of bubble conversation. But the thing about journalism is that journalists really do have to discuss our professional standards out in public. We can just talk about the way that other professions do. And journalism isn't really a profession, but the way that other professions set standards behind closed doors. We just do it in print. But so after Tom Cotton, or after the Times commissioned this op-ed from Senator Tom Cotton, there was a big outpouring of outrage from a lot of people, including a number of Black journalists within the Times, who actually all got together and decided to have a Twitter campaign. So they were tweeting against their own paper. And it worked. The editor of the editorial page, Jim Bennett, had to resign, and his deputy was reassigned. And the Times said that it was it wanted to open a discussion on the subject of this op-ed and editorial practices. And the journalist Wesley Lowery, who is not with the Times, he was with the Washington Post, and he actually kind of lost his job a few months ago. But he is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who's made, and again, probably a lot of people don't know this because you don't look at bylines, and it takes a while to understand what somebody's contribution has been. Wesley Lowery is a young Black journalist who reported from Ferguson for the Washington Post, and who has made a singular contribution to a complete shift in the way that the media cover police violence. from covering police violence as a series of individual cases, like every time as though it were shock and horror, to covering police violence against Black men as a system. Right? And there was a team of journalists who worked at the Washington Post who put this data together after Ferguson. And Wesley Larry was one of those people, and they got a Pulitzer Prize for this. And it really has, now that studies have been done on how media coverage changed, it really changed the way the mainstream media cover police violence. And so it's made a huge contribution to the shift of public opinion that we have seen now, right? So Wesley Lowery tweeted, "It's time to stop using objectivity as our standard and use moral clarity." And all these journalists like Andrew Sullivan and other kind of the conservative edge of liberal, generally older, generally white, generally male journalists said, "Oh no! How can we forfeit objectivity? Moral clarity is really just a new orthodoxy." So there's been this slate of pieces, most notably Andrew Sullivan's, saying, "Oh, this is totalitarianism," which really misunderstands totalitarianism. Because totalitarianism is state power. And the people who are talking about creating a new narrative and people who are talking about moral clarity don't have the power, not only state power, but institutional power, right? And what we're really talking about is how power is used. And I think that the call to the times is, look, as the biggest newspaper in this country and the media organization that really sets the tone for everything, you have incredible power. So how are you going to use this power? Are you going to use it to amplify the state? Are you going to use it to amplify it in its most brutal expression, like when Tom Cotton says, "Let's send in the military"? Or are you going to use it to amplify voices that haven't generally been represented? Or are you going to do both? And if you're going to do both, in what proportion? Do you see your role as creating some sort of correction for which voices are amplified and in what manner? And so then we also got into this discussion of what moral clarity means. Because moral clarity does not mean having a single position and holding it up.
Right.
Moral clarity means, and the philosopher Susan Neiman, whose life's work has been on moral clarity, she's very clear. It's actually having clear values and taking everything on a case-by-case basis, right? Which is not that dissimilar from the ideals of objectivity, which is that you don't have an opinion going in, you figure it out. But it's very different from the practice of objectivity, because the practice of objectivity is really just a neutral, restrained tone, which I argue is not appropriate to the moment.
So Masha, the hour is getting late and we so appreciate your generosity of time. So I have a few final questions, many, many questions everybody wants to ask you. Everybody must get this book. There's a wonderful website, Rabbi Rapport. Can you put it in or remind me, it's bookshop.org. Is that the correct?
Yes,
I want to make sure I have the correct place. Bookshop.org.
In the chat to everybody.
And that you can buy from independent bookstores. We've just touched the tips of many, many important things. Masha is a wonderful, clear writer, worth reading over and over again. Strongly urge people to get this book and to read it, as well as you can Google the article that I referred to, which was immediately after the election, called Autocracy Rules for Survival. And follow Masha if you're on Twitter or Facebook or in any social media. Masha's voice is very important. But Masha, I've got to end with a really important question. Everybody knows, I think, that I'm a passionate fan of the TV show, The Americans. And I don't know that everybody knows, but Masha was the Russian translator for that TV show. And Masha, would you just end by telling everybody the story of how you became the translator for that show? I just love this story.
Okay. So
but
funny.
Please, will you tell me that they're going to have another season with them back in Russia? No.
I don't think so. I think that show's over. But I mean, I think
it's my favorite show.
the best TV show ever.
I know.
So
this is one of my favorite stories of all time. I tell everybody this story. I'm no longer sure I have the details. So let's hear it from you, Masha.
So actually, I was first exposed to the Americans. I was still living in Moscow, and June Thomas, who at Slate, asked me to watch some episodes and like write something in dialogue with her. So I watched some episodes before it was airing, and I thought, this is amazing. This is just unbelievable. I mean, so psychologically smart, so extraordinary. So I wrote a rave about it and about how insightful it was. And then I started watching it. And of course, there's so many people were watching it, but there was a kind of community of Russian speakers who were watching the show. And if you recall,
there's a lot of Russian.
Every episode was in Russian. And as time went on, more and more of the episode was in Russian. And so people would tweet about the translations. And the translations were awful. And so there was like this, there was a community of gripers.
So you should say there were translations because the original writers would write it in English. And then it would get translated to Russian. And then the actors would, Russian actors theoretically, I guess they are, right? Were they Russian actors?
In the early seasons, they were mostly emigres. And then later they were like, they were very much more recent emigres who spoke better Russian.
So, but they were reading lines that had been translated from the original English into Russian. Okay, go ahead, Masha. I love this story.
And the translations were just literal and just awful and not non-idiomatic. And so like there was this community of people who would pile on after every episode and talk about how terrible the translations were. And then I get an email that was sent to a group of people by Anne Applebaum.
Another great voice.
Saying, does anybody know who could be a new translator for the Americans? Because I guess they'd gotten wind of how the Russian speakers thought that they were terrible. So I started asking around thinking, I wonder who could be a good translator. And I just I would walk around imagining how I would translate this and how I would translate that and what would constitute a good translation. And I thought, I want to do this. So I asked for the job. And they kind of couldn't believe it, but they gave me a test translation, and then I did it for 3 years, and it was the most fun I've had with work in years.
So say why your 1980s Russian was so good. I love that part of the story. See, this is my story now. Go ahead, Masha. The 1980s.
No, that's a really good point, because this was the thing, is that I immigrated to the United States in 1981, and then I went back to Russia in 1991. And it was a decade when the language really changed, because so much of the culture changed. The culture really opened up, and there was such a huge Western influence, and a lot of English language words came in and were assimilated into the language. And I had to learn all of that, because it was like waking up after 10 years of hibernation, but more like 50 years of hibernation for how much language had changed. So I had to learn new slang, learn which words had been assimilated. And I remembered that trauma very well. I remember all the words that I had to learn. So I also had a reservation of my pre-1981 Russian. And of course, the period that we're talking about is still Soviet, it's still before Perestroika. So I had to preserve that language. So it was the job for me, not just because I made myself sound like a great translator, but because I actually had this weird wedge in my Russian that allowed me to know exactly what kind of language I could use to translate them realistically.
It's a great story, Masha. I love you, Masha. I'm just such a fan of yours. Everybody needs to read everything that Masha publishes. And it's you have to do it.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Masha. Thanks so much for joining us tonight on this Pride Shabbat, because I really do feel like we, as in the queer community, have a little bit of a social distance, hopefully, to the society, to be able to think deeply and to be a little bit on the outside enough to be able to develop critical frameworks and questions. Like in our country, traditionally, immigrants have been that generation, but I think we also have it a little bit, even if we're born here. But for sure, one of the reasons we want to celebrate immigrants so much is the ability to look from the outside enough to give us a critical framework to understand how things are. But you're just a brilliant commentator. I'm not sure what I would have done in these last 3.5 years without you, Masha. So in front of everybody, I just want to express my deep, deep gratitude for your being a public intellectual in a time. Honestly, I think the one good thing has been there have been more and more of that. There's been an explosion in some ways of people engaging in ideas, which honestly wasn't so true before. And you're really at the center of that.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm at the center, but I think you're right. And we've been having a conversation, which is great. And I want to use this opportunity to say the most important conversation we're having right now is, of course, about defunding the police or abolishing the police. And my daughter has been spending most of her time down at City Hall, occupying it. And I want everybody to know that the city is about to take up its budget. Right? There's a proposal to take $1 billion, which is only 1/6 of the NYPD's operating budget, and reinvest it, or take it out of the police budget and invest it in communities of color. There are more than a dozen council members who have committed to this. There are, I believe, 8 who have said no, and the rest of them are on the fence. So please find out what your city councilor's position is and call them and tell them to support this defunding proposal, right? Because what makes safe communities is not a well-funded, well-armed police. What makes safe communities is investment in their public space, in their infrastructures, in their schools.
It's amazing that we're at this place where these conversations are happening. It's really a transformation. That's a good one. And honestly, the role of the cell phone and of that it was a 17-year-old kid who filmed George Floyd's murder. And without that, we wouldn't be able to have this kind of response. But honestly, even with it, there have been murders by the police have been on cell phones for a while now. So we're in a moment for all different reasons where we can pray that there's going to be real transformation. But for sure, we got to focus as well on the election in November. So thank you so much, Masha. Tell Yolka we want her to come back and give a talk. It sounds like we need to hear her voice as well. So give her our love as well. Take care, Masha, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, Happy Pride, Happy Pride. And we have services at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.